In the early decades of the 20th century, railroads were ruled by steam. They were loud, dirty, and demanding, machines that consumed coal, water, and human labor in equal measure. For generations, this was simply the cost of moving a nation. No one seriously questioned it until electricity quietly entered the conversation. By the 1930s, diesel technology offered something radical: separation. Power no longer had to live where the crew worked. Electricity made it possible to control machines remotely through cables instead of muscle. This idea planted a dangerous thought in the minds of railroad engineers and executives alike. What if power could be multiplied without adding people? The answer appeared in the form of a locomotive with no face, no windows, no controls, no seat for a human being. The B unit was not designed to be admired. It existed to disappear, to add horsepower while remaining unseen, unheard, and unoccupied. To its supporters, this was progress, a cleaner, more efficient future where trains could grow stronger without growing more complex. To its critics, it was a warning sign, a machine built specifically to replace labor, hiding its intentions behind smooth steel panels. For a brief moment in history, the diesel booster looked like the future of railroading. Railroads invested heavily. Engineers refined the concept. Power could now be snapped onto a train like a component, silent and obedient. But revolutions built on silence often leave echoes behind, and the B unit story would not end the way its designers expected. To understand the B unit, you must first understand what it deliberately lacked. Traditional locomotives were built around people. Cabs, windows, gauges, and controls existed because someone had to sit inside and command the machine. The B unit rejected that assumption entirely. On the outside, it appeared smooth and anonymous. No cab windows broke its streamlined shell. No headlights stared back at the track ahead. It looked less like a locomotive and more like a sealed container moving on rails. Yet beneath that quiet exterior lived a complete engine in every meaningful sense. Inside the B unit was the same heart found in its cab-equipped sibling. A powerful diesel prime mover turned a generator, feeding electricity to traction motors mounted on the wheels. Horsepower flowed the same way. Torque reached the rails with equal force. Mechanically, the B unit was not secondary, it was identical. The difference was authority. The B unit could not decide when to move, stop, or brake. It waited for instructions sent from elsewhere. Its existence depended entirely on another locomotive speaking for it. In practice, this meant one engineer could command multiple engines from a single cab. This separation of power from control was revolutionary. Railroads could now scale strength without scaling crews. Trains grew longer, heavier, and faster, without adding seats in the cab or names to the payroll. But the absence of a face carried symbolic weight. To some, the B unit represented efficiency perfected. To others, it was a machine built to erase human presence. The question was no longer whether it worked. The question was what its success would cost. The true breakthrough of the B unit was not the engine itself. It was control. Electricity made something possible that steam never could: command without proximity. At the center of this shift was the multiple unit cable, known simply as the MU. The MU cable was thick, heavy, and deceptively simple. When connected between locomotives, it carried a small set of electrical signals that replaced entire crews. Throttle position, direction of travel, brake commands, dynamic braking. Through these few signals, one engineer could orchestrate a string of locomotives as if they were a single machine. In the cab of the lead A unit, the experience felt almost unreal. A slight movement of the throttle sent instructions racing down the cable, awakening engines that had no operator of their own. The B units responded instantly, their generators loading, traction motors biting into the rails. Power arrived without conversation, without hesitation. For railroad managers, the implications were staggering. Consists could be rearranged freely. Additional horsepower could be added in minutes. A train that once required multiple crews could now be handled by one. Efficiency was no longer theoretical, it was measurable. Yet this remote control came with an invisible trade. The cab became quieter. Fewer voices filled the locomotive. The rhythm of teamwork that once defined railroading began to thin. What the MU cable connected mechanically, it disconnected socially. Still, the system worked. Trains ran smoother. Grades were conquered with less drama. Fuel consumption stabilized. In the short term, the B unit seemed to offer everything railroads wanted. But power, once centralized, rarely remains unchallenged. And as the B unit spread, resistance began to grow, not from machines, but from people. Not everyone welcomed the rise of the B unit. While executives celebrated efficiency charts and fuel savings, the mood in rail yards and union halls grew increasingly tense. To the men who had built their lives around steam and early diesel work, the B unit was not an innovation. It was a warning. For decades, every locomotive meant jobs. Engineers, firemen, hostlers, maintenance crews, each role woven into the daily rhythm of railroading. The B unit disrupted that balance by design. It added power without adding people. Its blank walls and empty interior became symbols of absence rather than progress. Labor unions moved quickly, pamphlets circulated, meetings grew heated. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen argued that every locomotive on the rails, cab or not, still required trained eyes and hands. Diesel or steam, they said, responsibility did not disappear just because a window did. Railroads responded with cold logic. The B unit had no controls, no seat, no reason, they claimed, for a crew member to ride inside. Arbitration hearings turned into debates over definitions. What qualified as a locomotive? What qualified as work? Compromises emerged, but they were temporary. Some agreements guaranteed positions for a time. Others offered retraining. Yet the direction was clear. Each new B unit placed on the rails shifted power away from labor and toward systems. The conflict was not merely about jobs. It was about identity. Railroading had always been a human profession, shaped by skill and experience. The B unit questioned whether that human presence was still essential, or merely historical. As resistance grew, railroads faced a choice: adapt the concept, or push forward and accept the consequences. Debate could only go so far. In railroading, arguments are settled on the main line. If the B unit was going to survive, it had to prove itself under load, on grades, and in full view of those who doubted it. That test arrived at the end of the 1930s. Locomotive Corporation introduced its FT freight locomotive, designed from the start as part of a system rather than a standalone machine. Each unit, cab or booster, produced the same horsepower. When coupled in AB or ABA sets, the numbers became impossible to ignore. In 1939, an FT demonstrator consist was sent on a cross-country tour. It moved from Chicago to the coasts, through mountain passes and urban terminals, stopping only long enough for executives and crews to witness what diesel boosters could do. The demonstration was not subtle. Long freights climbed grades without helpers, schedules tightened. Steam locomotives, once unquestioned, were quietly outperformed. For many railroad leaders, this was the moment everything changed. The B unit was no longer a theory or a threat. It was a solution. Orders followed quickly. What had been an experiment became a standard. Crews, too, began to adapt. While some remained skeptical, others recognized the advantages. Power was smoother, failures were fewer, trains behaved more predictably. The system worked, whether everyone liked it or not. By the early 1940s, the outcome was clear. The diesel booster had earned its place on the main line. But success would bring consequences the designers never fully anticipated. By the early 1940s, the question was no longer whether the B unit worked. The industry had already answered. Across North America, long strings of A and B units became a familiar sight, their smooth sides and uniform proportions signaling a new order on the rails. Manufacturers moved quickly. Alco, Baldwin, Fairbanks Morse, and Montreal Locomotive Works all introduced their own versions of cableless boosters. Each company promised the same future: scalable power, reduced crews, and modular efficiency. Railroads embraced the idea with enthusiasm. Fleets were standardized. Lash-ups grew longer. Horsepower became something you could simply add. Operationally, the advantages were undeniable. Trains no longer needed helper engines stationed at mountain bases. Consists could be assembled to match demand, then broken apart just as easily. Maintenance schedules simplified. The railroad became less a collection of individual locomotives and more a system of interchangeable components. But standardization has a hidden cost. As B units multiplied, flexibility quietly narrowed. A booster without a cab was powerful, but dependent. It could not lead. It could not work alone. It could not respond independently when conditions changed. For the moment, this dependency seemed irrelevant. Railroads were expanding. Traffic was predictable. The system was optimized for long, heavy point-to-point runs. The B unit thrived in that environment. Yet the very conditions that made boosters indispensable would not last forever. And as the industry evolved, the strengths of the B unit would slowly reveal themselves as limitations. The B unit was built for a world that valued consistency, long runs, predictable schedules, trains that moved from point to point without interruption. For a time, railroading fit that model perfectly. But industries change faster than machines. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, railroads began facing new demands. Freight patterns diversified. Switching yards grew busier. Routes became more fragmented. Trains were expected to stop, start, reverse, and work locally, not just run endlessly between terminals. Here, the B unit began to struggle. Without a cab, it could not lead a movement. Without visibility, it could not safely operate in yard service. Each maneuver that required flexibility exposed the same weakness. The booster was powerful, but passive. Railroads found themselves shuffling consists not for efficiency, but for practicality. A B unit trapped at the wrong end of a train became dead weight. Turning entire lash-ups consumed time and space. What once simplified operations now complicated them. Some railroads attempted workarounds. Others accepted the inefficiency as a trade-off. But the industry was quietly learning a new lesson. Power alone was no longer enough. Visibility, independence, and adaptability mattered just as much. The B unit had not failed. It was simply optimized for a version of railroading that was already disappearing. And as new locomotive designs emerged, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The answer to the B unit's limitations did not arrive as a radical invention. It arrived as a compromise. Railroads no longer wanted locomotives optimized for one task. They needed machines that could do many things reasonably well, anywhere on the network. The road switcher embodied that shift. Models like Alco's RS series and EMD's GP and SD lines abandoned streamlining in favor of function. Walkways ran the length of the locomotive. Handrails replaced smooth sides. Visibility became a priority rather than an afterthought. Most importantly, every unit had a cab. A road switcher could lead or trail, run forward or backward, haul freight across states, then spend the afternoon switching cars in a yard. No reconfiguration required, no dependency on a partner unit. From an accounting perspective, the math was compelling. One locomotive could replace a pair. Training simplified, crews adapted quickly, maintenance favored standardized, self-contained units over specialized components. In comparison, the B unit began to look like an artifact from a transitional moment. It offered unmatched efficiency in specific scenarios, but demanded a system built around its needs. The road switcher demanded nothing. Railroads voted with their orders, production lines shifted. Cableless boosters became rare exceptions rather than default choices. The industry was not rejecting the B unit because it failed, but because something better aligned with the future had arrived. Yet even as the B unit faded, it refused to disappear completely. The decline of the B unit did not mean immediate extinction. Railroads are practical institutions. and expensive machines are rarely discarded simply because fashions change. Instead, the booster entered a new phase of existence: adaptation. Some B units found second lives as support machines. In the 1970s, as passenger trains demanded increasing electrical power for lighting, heating, and air conditioning, surplus boosters were stripped of traction equipment and rebuilt as head-end power cars. Once designed to pull with brute force, they now quietly supplied electricity to entire trains. Others were modified in more unusual ways. A handful of cabeless units received improvised control cabs, boxy and inelegant, grafted onto streamlined bodies. These rebuilt locomotives returned to service not as symbols of progress, but as proof of necessity. Function mattered more than form. For a brief moment, the B unit even regained prestige. In the late 20th century, railroads like Santa Fe paired modern high-horsepower cab units with newly built boosters, reviving the AB concept for marketing and operational consistency. Sleek paint schemes and long uniform lash-ups evoked memories of an earlier diesel age. But these were exceptions, not reversals. Each adaptation acknowledged the same truth. The original role of the B unit was gone. Survival required transformation. By the time modern locomotives delivered more power than entire B unit consists once had, the booster's fate was sealed. Yet its story was not finished. It had become history. The B unit did not vanish because it failed. It disappeared because the world it was built for no longer existed. Railroading moved on, and in doing so, exposed the limits of a design shaped by a specific moment in history. As locomotives grew more powerful, the logic of modular boosters weakened. A single modern diesel could deliver the horsepower of multiple early units, without the complexity of cables, dependencies, or specialized consists. Flexibility replaced specialization as the industry's highest priority. Safety standards evolved. Visibility mattered. Crew awareness mattered. A locomotive without a cab became harder to justify in an environment shaped by regulation and liability. What once looked efficient now appeared constrained, yet the booster's disappearance should not be mistaken for irrelevance. The B unit taught railroads how to think in systems. It proved that control could be centralized, that power could be distributed, and that machines did not need to be independent to be effective. Today, only a handful of B units survive, preserved in museums or maintained by volunteers who understand their significance. Their smooth sides and silent interiors tell a story not of failure, but of transition. Innovation always answers the needs of its time. When those needs change, even the most revolutionary ideas must step aside. The B unit did exactly that, leaving behind a legacy that reshaped railroading, then quietly made room